of his involvement with the Black freedom struggle on and off campus. We are also clear that his work is part of efforts of collective struggle, a part of many iterations of study and struggle with comrades and forces that desire to see Africana people free. And it is with this that I want to be clear to highlight that this session tonight is Communiversity's inaugural event in partnership with Africa Woke Now Project and Black Workers for Justice, of which Abdul and Africa Woke Now Project collective member Tasneem Siddiqui, and many of those in this session right now are a part of. I look forward to all of us engaging with this discussion. Communiversity is an educational institution of the Black working class and the Black liberation movement. Communiversity is a working group of Black Workers for Justice, one of the longest Black workers organizations based in Eastern North Carolina. Communiversity with Black Workers for Justice is an institution mapping and documenting the history of the Black freedom struggle, particularly in the US South, as well as engaged in developing working class leadership. This session is also part of a constellation of programs that will be coming over the next few months to include an offshoot of sorts of the recent program that was held a few weeks ago with UNC Chapel Hill Sonia Stone Center, where Abdul presented Dialectics of Liberation, the African Liberation Support Movement. And probably just as, or more importantly, we're excited and honored for the opportunity to be with those who tapped into this webinar, those who are watching via YouTube, and those who will tap into this discussion later. As quick introductions to Abdul Alkalimat and our good colleague and friend and comrade, Josh Myers, who is joining us tonight for this conversation. Abdul Alkalimat is a founder of Black Studies and an author of many books and papers about Black liberation. He wrote the first college textbook for the field, Introduction to Afro-American Studies, which has seen 7 editions, and the last one free and online, of which we all have used at some point at some time. A lifelong scholar, activist, and organizer, with a PhD from University of Chicago, he has lectured, taught, and directed academic programs across the United States, the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and China. Of his early and continued contributions were serving as chair of the Chicago chapter of SNCC, co-founding the Organization of Black American Culture in 1967, as well as the Black Radical Congress and other formations. Raised in Chicago's Cabrini row houses, he is now a professor emeritus of African American Studies and Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Of course, recent works, The History of Black Studies, published Pluto Press, 2021, Dialectics of Liberation, the African Liberation Support Committee or Movement, published again this year, and a number of other works that all of which are found, and most of which is freely available on his website. Again, a source which we all have used and continue to use to this day. In addition to being a member of the Africa Woke Now Project Collective, Josh Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He is author of We Are Worth Fighting For, a history of the Howard University student protests of 1989, and the recently released Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition, as well as the editor or a editor of A Gathering Together, a literary journal. His work has been published in Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, the Journal of African American Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, to name a few. His current book project of Black Studies was submitted, and I'm sure we will engage a little bit with that tonight, and will soon be published. And he could talk about that a little bit himself. Will soon be published with Pluto Press. And this is one of the many reasons we thought that he needed to be included in this conversation, because of not only this work, but because of his ability to really bridge a lot of the history in the context of generational knowledge production and access. Last but not least, I want to give a special shout out to the Siddiqui sisters, Tasneem and Tabassum for the artwork on the announcements and flyers and all other social media, and Tasneem for literally keeping everything on track while teaching at HBCU. Ajamu, Amiri, Dillahunt, and the Dillahunts, the whole Dillahunt family, for plugging us in. Shafia being the organizer she is, and of course, Saladin Muhammad as being one of the principal reasons we are here. And of course, the rest of the Communiversity and Black Workers for Justice Organizing Collective. Please forgive me if I did not call your name. It is not intentional, but rest assured you are recognized, valued, and appreciated. And as we move forward, I will be sure to acknowledge this. The format we are moving with this evening is conversational. Baba Abdul Alkalimat will set the terms of our engagement. And after this, we will move into the conversation. Please utilize the chat feature for comments and things that you think that we should include or integrate in the conversation, and use the question answer function to ask questions. In order to not delay any longer, I will now turn it over to Baba Abdul Alkalimat.
Well, thank you so very much for inviting me and for that generous introduction. Speaking to the Communiversity, through the Communiversity, is very important. I was part of the Chicago Communiversity, which was in the late 60s, early 70s in Chicago. And then later, when I took my first teaching position at Fisk University, we discovered that Charles Johnson had created something called People's College, where they taught people, lower income people, the masses of Black working people in Nashville, Tennessee, to survive in the society. We recreated People's College with the new mission to not only survive, but to transform the society. So speaking through the Communiversity is a very special opportunity for me, and I thank you for the invitation. I want to start by giving a general overview to what I think is the best inclusive definition of Black studies. There are 5 points I want to make, and I'll just read this slide. Black studies include those activities, 1, that study and teach about African Americans, including Africans and other African descendant peoples. In other words, it's a pedagogical activity, the teaching and learning about the Black experience. 2, where Black people themselves are the main agents or protagonists of the study and learning. This doesn't exclude anybody. It simply says that the main focus of who is doing the teaching and who's doing the learning are Black people themselves. And 3, it counters racism and contribute to human liberation. This isn't a neutral activity. We are affirming our humanity, and that means we have to resist all forms of racism and national oppression. And 4, that celebrate the Black experience. This is a celebratory, this is a cultural activity in which we not only study ourselves, we profoundly perform ourselves. And lastly, Black studies presents an analysis of the economies, cultures, and politics of the American hemisphere and Western Europe from the perspective of people of African descent. In other words, the point is that this doesn't segregate us from other bodies of knowledge or the world in general. It rather creates a perspective so that we see the world through the lens of our experience and not the experience of somebody else. Now, the slogan of the National Council for Black Studies is academic excellence and social responsibility, a term I created when I was teaching at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and was adopted by the National Council for Black Studies as the national mission. Academic excellence and social responsibility, theory and practice. And I wanted this slide to be important, and I wanted to relate to North Carolina. Our standard for excellence is us. It's not the standard of excellence of institutions that have maintained the support of slavery, of racism, et cetera, but rather we have to look to ourselves. And so here's a brother, Earl Thorpe, what does it say? 27 years at North Carolina Central University. So here are some of his books. A great historian. He was also an activist. He was active with us in the African Liberation Support Committee and even more serious political activities that dealt with the Black working class in North Carolina. And I think that all scholars and students at HBCUs need to look to the historical faculty at HBCUs for inspiration and for, as I said, standards of excellence. Now, just a brief comment about the history of Black studies at the HBCUs. Of course, HBCUs curriculum, this curriculum was established like the mainstream, and therefore it was profoundly Eurocentric. As you can see here, the great focus on Greek and Latin. This is Fisk University in the 1920s. Now, this is not to say that this literature should not be read. Again, it should be read from a Black perspective and not from a perspective as if we were Greek or we were from Italy. But it didn't remain that way. So by 1943, as you can see, Fisk University faculty initiated an African Studies program. Now, this is very important because the normal narrative of African studies in the United States is that Melville Herskovits created it in 1948 at Northwestern University. Not true at all. What created it was the effort at HBCUs, beginning at Fisk University. Mark Canna Watkins, an anthropologist who had studied with Edwin Sapir at the University of Chicago and other people, created this program. And I happen to know because I got the brochure of the program. So I'm not making this up. The point is that HBCUs have been demeaned and marginalized, and we have to bring that story back central to the development of higher education in the United States. Historically, the most profound thing that leads to Black studies is the ideological development that occurred in the community among the masses of people. I'd like to think of this ideological basis of the freedom struggle really in 5 ways. Pan-Africanism, the link to Africa. Nationalism, the link to ourselves. Unity, Black unity. Third, Black liberation theology, that is religion as a source of morality to resist the immoral racism and national oppression that we have faced. Feminism, or as Alice Walker would put it, womanism. That is, the struggle of Black women is so central to the transformation, not only to the external oppression of Black people, but the internal patriarchy in the Black community as well. And then lastly, of course, socialism, the critical appraisal and rejection of the economic exploitation that is normative to the capitalist society that we have been living in. So I start out by talking about Black studies as intellectual history. That's what I've just touched on. The second part of the book, The History of Black Studies, is Black studies as social movement. This is very important because every social movement for social justice, for emancipation, for freedom, has included an educational component. And each one of these social movements have had really 2 kinds of educational activity. On the one hand, there has been education for the broad masses of people to build consciousness, because theory and action go together. And so to help people understand is a precondition for helping them to act. The second way that education has come through the movement is the education of cadre. That is to say, the education of people who become staff, who take on the responsibility to make sure that organizations development, that make sure that decisions made are actually carried out. The people who have a long distance run and not just a short engagement. That's something that's going on today with Black Lives Matter. We've had the spontaneous stage of the movement, and now we are hoping that out of that spontaneous stage is developed cadre who can carry on. So we've looked at these 6 movements. The freedom movement, what a lot of people call the civil rights movement, Black people have always called it the freedom movement, because civil rights makes it seem like it's tied into the Constitution and in mainstream politics. Of course, that is a tactical aspect of it, but it is the freedom movement. The Black Power movement. This occurred in the middle 60s in the rejection, really, of the minimal demands that were met by the civil rights movement. So Black Power, turning to our own resources and our own networks for our agency in the world. The Black Arts movement, virtually every art genre, self-organized. The writers, the poets, the dramatists, the musicians, the painters, and they created art in search of a Black aesthetic, which was a profound affirmation of the way in which the masses of Black people lived. This was not an appeal to the gatekeepers of the mainstream society. This was a turn away. So the critical issue there was audience. Suddenly the audience becomes Black people themselves. The new communist movement. For the first time since the 1930s, Black workers on the shop floor began to struggle, and this created a new surge of interest in socialism, a new surge that we could actually imagine something beyond the capitalist crisis that we were living. I'll have more to say about this. Black women's movement, say more about that, and the student movement. So here we see examples of the freedom schools that came out of the freedom movement and are a possibility whenever Black people struggle. So whenever there's a school boycott and students don't go to school, the emergent institution is the freedom school. So classes are being held in churches and community centers. This was part of the Mississippi Summer Project in the 60s, and it is something that has spread throughout the country and is always possible, the freedom schools. Now, this concept that I use here, the emergent institution, is something that is constantly happening. When a need arises, people come together to create a new kind of organization that meets that need. Here we have an example of one of the most important emergent institutions that was developed after Black Power in 1966. So by 1969, after a student struggle at Duke University, where the students joined with people who had been active in other North Carolina organizations like the Greenboro Association for Poor People and other organizations that had cadre, they came together to form Malcolm X Liberation University that becomes a reference point for the Black liberation movement for emergent institutions to meet the educational needs of activists in the movement. But when I talk about the new communist movement, I talk about the workers' movement. One of the best examples is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that was developed in Detroit. They had a newspaper, they had a bookstore, they had a publishing company, they had a book club and a major gathering to discuss books. All of these things were really part of workers self-organizing to create an educational program about the history of Black workers. This was part of Black studies, is the point I'm trying to make. Now here on this slide, you see what happened, just like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, you see Black Workers for Justice. 1982 still exists. What did the BWFJ have in its high point? They had a newspaper, Justice Speaks, not only covering politics and economics, but culture, talking about jazz, talking about the music of the church. In other words, it was an educational forum for the Black community. They had a radio program. They had a bookstore in Raleigh. So again, the workers' movement is a very important part, has been an important part of Black studies. The women's movement. Out of SNCC, various sisters, again, struggling with patriarchy in the society, struggling with patriarchy in SNCC, developed, along with other women from third world countries, an organization called the Third World Women's Alliance, formed in 1971. And as you can see on the left, Fran Beal, who was one of the great organizers of that organization. And then on the right, you see Audre Lorde, one of the great voices that helped to politicize the gay liberation movement and connect it to the Black liberation movement and the freedom movement and the struggle for social transformation overall. Now, the movement that leads to Black studies specifically is the Black student movement. Now, what happened is in the middle 60s, Black power created a new consciousness in the community. Uprisings everywhere. The demand was for more students to be admitted to institutions of higher education. And of course, the society decided, the rulers have decided, better to embrace these young people and bring them into the institution so we could, in quotes, normalize them. But what happened is the students brought the Black power consciousness that had developed in their community. And therefore, they rejected the institutional racism they experienced and demanded Black studies. That meant more Black students, more Black faculty, more Black courses, more Black meeting the needs of the Black community. And so here you see examples from San Francisco State and Cornell University. Now, I started out talking about Black studies as intellectual freedom, intellectual history. I then went to Black studies as social movement. Now, the third stage is Black studies as academic profession. What happens when Black studies enters into institutions of higher education? Every campus has a story, but I have summed this up into 6 aspects of experience that basically is the framework to understand each individual story. Social disruption. In other words, this wasn't because people were enlightened, it was because the students fought. They took over buildings. They did all kinds of things. And I was a part of that. Secondly, there was a national debate, a national discussion to create a consensus around what the hell is this thing called Black studies? We didn't demanded it. Now we have to create it. We have to unite around a common concern for it. And so that took place. There were conferences, there were seminars, there were summer institutes and workshops. Then there was building institutions. What was going to be the organizational form? A center, an institute, a program, a department? Are we giving degrees, minors, majors? Are we going to have graduate programs? All of this was then developed. Again, campus by campus, each campus had their own culture, their own style. And I cover a lot of this in the book. Then there was establishing the profession. This took place in really 3 ways. First, there were journals that created peer review, self-organized journals. Then there was PhD programs. And then third, there were organizations where the students and professors, graduate students in particular, could come together. They were theorizing. Theory is a summation of practice, is a summation of knowledge. That began to happen. And then lastly, the question of research. Norming research means creating methodology and creating collective research projects. Now, I want to talk about 2 ways that I'm envisioning the future of Black studies. One is Diaspora Studies. Black studies in the United States have now stimulated the study of the Black experience in every country of the world. The diaspora is now studying itself. A lot of them do talk about us, but for example, in Africa, this is a very important point. We study Africa. Africa has yet to study us. There's a lot to be discussed about that. Second point about the future is information technology, the new tools. As you can see here on the right, this is really a sort of way in which we conceived of this over 25 years ago. This is when we began. And so you can see Black studies as it exists, and then you can see the transformation of Black studies. I mean, after all, here we are on Zoom. This is in part of that new transformation. And then we can see what we did at the University of Toledo, where I was when we developed this. The last two things I want to mention before I close. One is this question of method. We have to be self-reliant and think for ourselves. And so we developed this 7-point method we call the D7 method. And there are two aspects of this that are different from just what you might normally think of as the method of scholarship. One is D3, digitization. This allows us to have freedoms that we didn't have before. For example, we can collaborate. Distance means nothing now. We can share data. We can work simultaneously on a body of data, on a text. We can edit a text together. And then lastly, D7, difference. In other words, answering the question, so what? In other words, we're trying to defeat racism. We're trying to advance our cause of our people. We're trying to move toward freedom. So the D7 method is something I'd like to present for your consideration. And then lastly, Black studies, why and so what? Well, the interesting thing about Black studies is that if you take every classroom in the country, every semester, you're dealing with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of hours of student work. We'd like to transform that work from simply being a site of consumption, taking your syllabus, reading books that you assign, et cetera, have discussions in class, to a site of production, producing knowledge that is of use to the community and to Black studies. Just give two examples. One is every Black studies program should have a history of itself. That's an important aspect of the Black Power movement, because Black studies was a Black Power project. And it validates the connection between the community because there was no Black studies created that didn't have community support. And whenever it's attacked, it needs community support to survive. Secondly, every town needs a history of the Black community. So I ask you, particularly about North Carolina, of all the cities in North Carolina, can you name a history that is available to the working class to study the history of the town in which they live? We know that there are histories of Washington, D.C., of Detroit, of Cleveland, of Chicago. Of course, all of this needs to be synthesized and brought together in a form that is accessible to the working class. But we need a history of Rocky Mount. We need a history of all the local communities so that people can respect their struggle, because every history of every town is a history of struggle. And that, after all, is one of the main purposes of Black studies. So let's talk about it. Thank you very much for listening. That's 50, those pictures, that's 50 years right there.
Wow, thank you so much, Baba Alkalimat. You know, as we were talking a little bit before this, and Josh and others who are on this call will know that this is an articulation. This work is clearly an articulation of what we would consider to be history as a weapon, right? This idea that we can utilize all of this knowledge that has been produced over 50 years, things that you've engaged in. A lot of the people on this call, you were literally struggling with, you know, developing ideological battles and, you know, those types of things to really get to this particular point where folk like myself and Josh and other people have been really trying to see where we're going, see where we were, but see where we're going. And this book brings all of those pieces together. You know, I encourage everybody to get this book. But what I wanted to do now is really trace our map, basically a mini intellectual, our movement into Black studies. But, you know, for you and yourself, what were some of those things that happened that pushed you into this particular form of struggle. And then, of course, we want to look at this in the context of Josh, because we want to hear this. One of the things that you say that you wrote this book for is generational transition of knowledge. Looking on your screen right now, we are literally generational. I'm in between you and Josh. You see what I'm saying? So, I think that is important. And again, we're going to bring other people into this conversation. But what is it that produced you? What was your trajectory into Black studies?
Well, I guess I can talk about two or three things. I mean, first of all, I was born into a family that really represents the contradiction and the tension that propelled the Black liberation movement forward. My great-great-grandfather was a slave in Kentucky that bought his freedom, bought 16 family members out of slavery, and created a town that was a station on the Underground Railroad. So I grew up with the stories of that family history. Then I had two aunts. One aunt was a activist in the Communist Party. She was one of the people who helped to organize Steel with W.Z. Foster, Eleanor Rye. And the other aunt was a graduate of Fisk University, and she was worked with Margaret Burroughs in creating the DuSable Museum of African American Culture and the Southside Community Arts Center, which is the only WPA project that's still in existence in Chicago, Southside Community Arts Center. So these two aunts really helped to shape me. And then it was really part of our generation. I mean, SNCC developed, the sit-in movement developed, the interest in Black history developed. I was from Chicago, so Lerone Bennett, Jeff Donaldson, Russell Adams, who was head of Black Studies at Howard for generations, all it seemed. They really mentored me, and I was young, I was a junior, really working with them. The last thing I'll say is accidents happen. I'm on the bus going to, this is summer, and I'm working part-time at the post office downtown. And I'm reading a book. It's packed, and I'm standing on the bus, and I'm reading a book by Ashley Montague called The National Superiority of Women. Brother taps me on the shoulder and says, "I know Ashley Montague." I said, "What?" Conrad Kent Rivers, the poet, he's also going to the post office to work. So then that was it. So that whole summer, he schooled me. I read all the writers of the Harlem Renaissance and others. And then he introduced me to Hoyt Fuller, who was the editor of Negro Digest and then became Black World. And so it was that connection, the three of us then created OBASI, the Organization of Black American Culture, that led to the Wall of Respect. So family history, aunts, accidents of connection. And by the way, I've actually tried not to be who I am. I just can't do it. I mean, in other words, life pulls you into, activity. And the beauty of living as long as I've lived, and, I'm going to be 80 years old in November, I hope to live longer than that. But you fall out with people, but if you live long enough, you reconnect with people. And then you discover later, you don't even remember all the reasons why you had fallen out in the first place. So being cadre means that you develop this bonding social capital in the movement that sometimes is stronger than not. But, and as you've indicated, there's some veterans on the line right now listening to this, and I know they know what I'm talking about.
Josh, thank you for sharing that, Josh. How'd you get here?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting though. I mean, I'm hearing Baba talk about these connections, and it's like, these are the same connections. So I'm just happy to be here and be in conversation with you, because when you talk about Chicago, I can spend 10 minutes tracing my genealogy just through Chicago too. the Chicago School of Anderson Thompson, Jacob Carruthers. In many respects, I'm connected in that way through their progeny, through SNCC, and in particular, what was happening in Atlanta. In SNCC, I'm connected to Brother Abdul in that way. I don't know if Karen Spellman's here, but I definitely made sure she got the invitation when I realized I was being in conversation with you. I've been working with Karen for the last 5 years.
Oh, wow.
On all kinds of stuff. You know, she's a workhorse. So whatever she's working on, I was working on it too. And she always talks about that time in Atlanta. So I'm connected in that way too. I'm from Orangeburg, South Carolina. And so, you know, we grew up knowing about the Orangeburg massacre, not knowing a lot about it, but we grew up hearing about it. And the relationship between the student movement in Orangeburg and Black studies was kind of a silent influence on me. It wasn't overt. And then of course, DC and Howard, the African Liberation Support Committee, and the work there. When I was an undergrad at Howard, we tried to revive the Pan-Africanist movement. We had a conference. I spent a year organizing a conference for Pan-Africanism and young people, the Pan-African Youth Summit. And so we knew what had happened in 1972 in Washington, DC. We knew what had happened in 1970 with the founding of the African Heritage Studies Association on campus and all the conversations that had been had at Howard. And the professors that worked at Howard that you worked with, Baba, I mean, they were our influencers when it came to organizing around Pan-Africanism. So there's so many ways to talk about these connections. It's in organizing, it's in student movements, it's in families, it's in friends, it's in questions of Black studies theory and epistemology. It's in all of those things. And so I guess my formal track would be to really speak to coming out of Howard, getting into Temple, trying to figure out how to do Black studies at Temple, coming out of Temple, and then realizing that there are other ways of doing Black studies, and then trying to filter those into our connection to community, because that's what matters most to me. You know, academic legitimacy is a thing, and we should battle and fight that. But if it doesn't speak to what our community needs and what our community wants, then I'm not the person to do that kind of work. And so the fact that this is a forum that is specifically geared towards the Communiversity idea is something that's very near and dear to my heart. You know, in DC, we had Drum and Spear. And so I think about that a lot. I think about how to revive those kinds of formations a lot. We had the New School of Afro-American Thought. We had, you know, we still have Nation House and all of the different African-centered educational institutions. And so I'm shaped by that just as much as I'm shaped by Howard, just as much as I'm shaped by what happened in terms of formal African-American studies programs. And so what I love about this book is that this book introduces all of those elements, all of those structures, institutions, movements, and initiatives alongside the story of the institutionalization, which has not been done in any history before. And so I know I have students on this call, and I know I have people who are just being introduced to Black studies on this call. Black studies ain't just what happens in our classrooms, right? We must defend what happens in our classrooms. We have to defend what happens in our classrooms, but it is not just what happens in our classrooms. And so when we talk about Black studies being our lives, it's literally, we have a representative of what that looks like. And what happens in this text is you see Black life. You see Black institutional life, you see Black social life. There are moments where we're talking about jazz. There's moments when we're talking about literature. There's moments when we're talking about taking over A buildings, because they're all part of Black studies, because Black studies is about our lives. And so to be able to do that, one has to live that life. And that's what I deeply appreciate about this particular moment. And that's one of the messages that I want to share. And this is something that Vincent Harding one of my real strong influences. Only got to meet him once near the end, but one of the things that he said in 1974 in his famous article, The Vocation of the Black Scholar, which I teach every semester, you gotta live this thing. And by living it, that informs how we think about it and write about it. It's in the living. And so thank you, Baba Abdul, for everything that you've done over the last 50 plus years, because it literally makes what I do possible. And the students that I'm teaching are in here witnessing this. So it's going to make what they do possible too. This really is about genealogy and about connection. And we have to make sure that we protect that.
No, thank you, Josh. And you made a couple of segues that I think that now we can really move into a little bit of the analysis are using this text. And we just want to deal with a couple of ideas. We want to deal with, particularly the intellectual the intellectual history part, but also this needless contestation between study and struggle. This is the reason why, and this is what Josh is alluding to in the context of it's a contestation that was produced or introduced for a particular reason, as I would argue. And what I'm saying here is that I would love for us, Baba Alkalimat, you can take a stab at this question or comment or idea first, and then we'll move to Josh. I would love for us to engage the lingering questions around the politics of knowledge production in white and Black institutions. Really kind of moving into, do we need to engage in questions around legitimacy of Black studies as an academic project in the 21st century? Does Black studies have anything to prove in an institutional context? And the reason why this question I think is important is simply because the role of the university today, do we need to, or should we reestablish this base in the work structures outside of the university, whether it's Black or white university? So if you can, just jump right in, Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to be very serious about the context in which we exist. In other words, when Black Studies entered the campus, we entered into an environment that had established standards and procedures. And I think we need to take those very seriously. So for example, there is this concept of publish or perish. I used to, really try to toss that aside. And then it suddenly occurred that maybe there's something serious about that. In other words, intellectual productivity is what is expected by the Black community. And, so if you are privileged to have an academic position, just to be absolutely frank, it's time to get off your you-know-what and be productive. So productivity is critical. And one of the things you'll see in the book is when you look at the HBCUs, those brothers and sisters who were forced into HBCUs couldn't get a job in the mainstream institutions, outproduced the people in those institutions. Look, we do it in basketball, we do it in track. What's happening? What's happening? I went to work in the HBCU and I know what the culture is. And a lot of times the culture is not progressive. And then people need to get to work. And that's generally a criticism of the Black middle class anyway. It happens in high school and elementary school, et cetera. I mean, it's time to, we used to say kazi is the Blackest of all, kazi being the Kiswahili word for work. Kazi is the Blackest of all. The second point is the question of audience, though. Who are you publishing for? Who are you publishing to influence? It's the Black community. One of the things that we discovered is that at Fisk, the beginning was mimeographed. We went to Africa and the Institute of African Studies, and God, they were mimeographing stuff. So the main thing is to produce and distribute it to the Black community. So audience is critical. And we have to be an audience among Black intellectuals, but not as a way to model ourselves on mainstream activity. So for example, Word, that is a software package, has something called readability. When you write, check out what grade level you're writing for. So if you think Black people are going to read it, just like the main newspapers, et cetera, they write for 8th grade. This doesn't mean that you're not including your heavy ideas. It means you're doing what they used to say to Malcolm: make it plain, break it down, make it so I can understand it. I'm rational, I have experience, so help me understand this heavy idea you have. Then, of course, the last point is this: a room will stay dirty unless you sweep it clean. So we have to take the main ideas of the mainstream seriously and engage them. See, a lot of people want to just say, oh, well, forget that. Huh? These are the ideas of the ruling class. So we have to do what the Cubans say, the battle of ideas. So that means you take, for example, whatever discipline you're in, what are the ruling ideas? How do you engage them? You engage them with better data, with better logic, with relentless reason, and by embracing the consciousness of the masses of Black people. I mean, that's what we did in the 60s. I mean, people used to have to stop and listen. Then suddenly we started saying, wait, maybe there is something to this thing they call mother wit. Wisdom in the community. Because once you go to college, you suddenly think that's where the knowledge is, and we are better than our people. That's a fundamental mistake. You have to be able to listen and see, and then maybe you learn something.
Josh, you wanted to comment on that, because I mean, this is a very important point within the context of the university, right? This idea of who your audience is, who you're writing for, who you're thinking, and again, this, as I set out in my opening comments, that the collective processes of knowledge production is important, but also the access, which is the reason why, as you know, Josh, that we engage in Africa World Now project to really battle that bridge or those barriers with access to knowledge, but also how we have these conversations and framing these conversations.
Well, I think one thing that I loved about the book is that it took great care to list the journals and the newsletters and the ways in which Black Studies programs disseminated information to the masses. And not just within the era of Black Studies, but going back to where this book starts, which is the Black community itself. There is a sense that if we control or manage the ways in which information is shared in our communities, right, that goes a long way. Now, I don't know if print is going to be the way of the future. And I say that as somebody that writes books, which is a crazy thing to say, right? I love writing. I love the written word. But it might be another form now. I think we might be entering into another form. And so Black Studies obviously can't rely on print in the way that it has relied on print in the last 30, 40, 50 years. I think we should still write, of course. But where is our impact going to be in new media is a big question for me. I mean, think about the popular forms of, think about the popular ways that our students get knowledge and information. How often do we have to refute something in class that came out of Twitter, a Twitter space? I hate Twitter spaces, I'm sorry. Or from a podcast or a documentary. I mean, every other day, I heard on a podcast that, wait a minute, let's go back and study this. Because the person on the podcast didn't do no studying, right? unless they're listening to Africa World Now podcast.
True.
But there are some other good ones. But in
Yeah.
a general sense, I mean, you probably get the gist of what I'm saying is that there's a lot of information that's close to the truth, but ain't the full truth, that ends up being disseminated far more efficiently than what Black studies people can be doing and have done. And so we have to figure out new media. And I think there are a number of examples, especially since the pandemic, that have been generated, but I think we need to formally attach these to Black studies so that our students know that, you know, this is something that you can do. It's an additional thing that you can do with your Black studies knowledge, just participate in this new environment, because that's what our people are engaging. I mean, that's what we, you know, every time I engage with a friend who may not be in the academy, it's around what they heard on the podcast. It's around what they heard on the documentary. It's around a TV show that I didn't see yet. Did you see the Underground Railroad? I have to say, no, I didn't. But somebody has to say yes, and here's what it did, and here's what it didn't do, and here's what it should be doing, right? So we have to be in that space. And I think it's a difference between being the consultant in those spaces and being the producer. We have to produce out of those spaces too, I think, to ultimately get at what our predecessors were doing with print media, right? If you look at every major city, another strong point of the book is that it looks at cities, right? It looks at those local histories in the cities. If you look at the cities, everybody had a Black newspaper, everybody. Some had multiple Black newspapers, right? Then we had our national print media, right? That covered every aspect of the Black experience, right? We are in a moment where that's a major gap that we have to fill so that our people can have, again, information that comes from us and it comes from people who are connected to this question of consciousness and liberation, consciousness raising and liberation.
Let me just make a quick point about this. I think it's true that there are these new vehicles for mass information distribution. But if you go back to that idea of social movements creating educational opportunities for masses of people and then for cadre development, if you're talking about cadre development, then you are talking about people who are reading. Mm-hmm. And I think that, the old books remain relevant.
Oh, yeah.
But a new form of publishing, something that I talk about in my point number 10 of the 10 action plans, is something we call the slaper. A lot of times people give a presentation with the PowerPoint slides, and which again is one of those new forms of communication, and then have some commentary that go with it. Well, if you put the slides together with a paper, you get a slaper. And if you go to this document, you'll find several examples of slapers that I've created. So what I'm saying is that what we started a long time ago is a lot of Black people like to talk. Well, that's a production of words through speech. But if we now have software that can listen to a speech and translate that into printed text, editing that printed text, suddenly now everybody can be productive. So we can't escape this notion of production, and we can't escape the concept of literacy. In other words, we have to have a mass of people who are literate. And that means they have to know how to read and write. And so we can't go off into kind of a middle class game of, we're going to have a hip hop archive at Harvard, because that's what our masses are involved in, while those people are privileging the bridge they're on into mainstream success. We have to go back to the question of, are the masses of Black people literate today? In the 60s, people were reading Frantz Fanon. I don't talk about people who had graduated from college. I'm talking about people who hadn't graduated from high school. We're reading Frantz Fanon. We're reading Malcolm. And so we have to insist upon literacy programs. So Black Workers for Justice, the question is, look, Lenin met Krupskaya, his wife, in a class where she was teaching literacy to workers. How literate are the workers in North Carolina? What grade level? If we want to get all the way real, We have to talk about literacy in our movement. Ignorant people cannot make a revolution, cannot make a transformation. In other words, people can get on TV, ain't got no conversation with the people who are running the opposition line. So as academics, we have to really be serious about, if we really want to transform society, what's required, not what the system has created, Twitter and all the rest of it. You know, those might just be distractions. And we have to create a counter motion. But reading and literacy are fundamental to what we're talking about. I know I'm a hard edge, but you know.
No, it's important, and that's the reason why I think that it is essential that we're having this conversation. Because I'm sitting in between generations here. We're part of I'm sitting in between being closely related to those who are engaged in struggle, personally related, and folk that are in here, folk that are on there. I just wanted to point out that Baba Saladin Muhammad said he read it in the Jet magazine. That's what he put into the chat. He said he would read it in the Jet. This contestation, this idea of reading is a very important, because Josh and other folk, us being in the classroom, and of course Baba Alkalimat, I'm sure you had to deal with this as well. Do you think, and I'm kind of detouring or adding on here, do you think that is important for us, particularly in the context of the audience that we're dealing with, to really disrupt this notion of reading? And here I'm thinking about Paulo Freire's the radical act of reading. I think when he talks about the idea, ideas precede words, and then we read the words, and then we measure the world, and then we put it all together to develop a consciousness, a critical consciousness. Do you think that we really, and Josh, I think this is what you're getting at here, is how do we use these forces, and the people are putting in the chat, which is actually a question. How do we access the resources we need to produce a form of media? Because this goes to your point number 10, Baba Alkalimat, on the future of Black studies. How do we produce? What do we use? Because we're in an environment, Josh, you know this, you mentioned the podcast. We're in an environment that we are inundated on a day-to-day basis of history and radical this and podcast this. But your comments on that, and then we'll move to Josh.
Well, one of the interesting things you find out when you're teaching and you're in a classroom is you're not only teaching a subject, you're actually teaching people. And, most people are reachable on the basis of their interests. Sometimes they have to be kind of shaken up a little bit, but their interests. And I taught a course called Introduction to Afro-American Studies. The students had to write a 3-page paper every week. Now, they didn't like that, but I made them do it. They wanted a grade, so they did it. I didn't tell them what the final was going to be. Then as we got close to the final, I said, okay, now the final is, you have to revise every one of those papers and add at least a page. So think about it, 15 weeks, 3 pages. Then you add a 4th times 15. So getting into 100 pages. Then they had to write an introduction, answering several questions. Then they had to design a cover, a piece of art, a collage, a picture, whatever, title. Then they had to go to the print shop and get 2 copies made, bound. First of all, that was their first book. Second of all, the second copy they had to send to their mama. I mean, when they left the print shop, their feet weren't touching the ground. So we have to make expectations that help people raise the level of their game. They don't want to, they don't even think they can. But after that class, every other class was a breeze. I mean, somebody said, well, you're going to have to write a 7-page paper for this course. They would fall out laughing. But what it does is it means that the faculty have to put their game shoes on, because you got to grade those damn papers. So we all have to learn how to work harder. I think Black people really want to be free. I don't think Black people want to be subservient and exploited, etc. But they have been brainwashed. And Black people are doing the service of the system by brainwashing them and getting paid to do it at very high levels. And we have to disrupt all of that and bring something different. That's when you say Du Bois used to lock his classroom door when the time came. So if you were late, you couldn't get in. I mean, let's raise the level. I just, I don't know. Anyway, that's what I think.
Josh, I think we'll probably get trouble in at this particular point. We like to do it in classroom. But Josh, did you want to?
Du Bois got into plenty of trouble.
Yeah, right. Josh, did you want to comment to that, or did you want to? Or did you want to? Because one of the things that I think is important in the midst of this conversation is the mechanisms and institutions within which historically, but also the ones that we can revive, particularly in the context of Black Workers for Justice, Communiversity. But Josh, what about this notion of the Black University? And of course, Baba, you definitely can really talk about what are some of the lessons or some of the ideas that can help us kind of institutionalize these ideas that we're talking about, the production of knowledge, the access to it, but also making sure that there's a space for community, intellectual, and knowledge production.
Independence, autonomy, making sure that these are valued. Like, we have to love ourselves enough to realize that we deserve our own space, right? That we can have these spaces, and it's not an affront to anybody else for us to have our own spaces. That comes out of I think a love for Black people, a love for being around Black people, being together. And this connects to something I wanted to say earlier, is that the reading part becomes part of an act of joy when you're reading together with people. When you're actually going through something with other people. It's not supposed to be a solitary thing. That's a Western concept. I think, therefore I am, right? Read together and you'll see the transformation. You'll feel the transformation much more differently, because it is a collective question. It is about our collective development, our collective wisdom. And that's what Black Studies was. It was the study group. It was the study group model exported to a kind of institutional framework. And it's those study groups that I love to talk about and think about, whether it's the Harlem History Club, which becomes the Edward Biden Society. We can trace so many of them. Garvey's study group. I mean, there's so many different examples of Black people saying, let's be over in this corner and let's just study. That's powerful on its own. And what I liked about the Biden Society is, I mean, these are people who had real jobs. These are people who work probably more than 9 to 5s. And they still carved out the time to study. They still carved out the time to study together. And Huggins had them producing out of that study too. I think John Henry Clark had to produce a play once and say, here's what we're studying, now you produce a play about it. That then becomes this question of production, right? And there's part of that studying together is like, once you do it enough, you can't help but want to produce. You can't help but want to add your own piece to this conversation. And so part of what I try to do in my classes is cultivate the love of studying and reading together. And, at a certain level, I even got rid of the sort of normative idea of assignment. Your assignment is to read together. And what it produced was, okay, this is what I want to know next. This is what I want to understand now. This is what I want to do after this is done, because I'm not satisfied. And out of my lack of satisfaction, I want to be able to grow. I want to be able to develop. I want to know what you know. I want to know what your teachers knew, and I want to know what their teachers knew. And I think that comes out of a sense of togetherness, a sense of creating a sacred and a safe space for Black students in a world that's not going to affirm them. We have to do that in Black studies. And that in and of itself is rigorous. You can't walk into that. You have to learn how to practice that. You have to learn how to be in community with students. And it's a beautiful thing once you master it. I ain't saying I mastered it yet, but I'm saying it's a beautiful thing because I've seen it modeled. That's what I'm saying. I've seen it demonstrated, and I've seen what comes out of that. So,
what I wanted to do right now is make this again. This is a truly collective process. I wanted to bring up to the stage of one of Baba Alkalimat's partners. Partner, we don't like to say partner in crime, one of his comrades that he has done a lot of work on, Baba Saladin Muhammad. He wanted to add to this conversation as well. But when we, as we're coming out of this, listening to and responding to whatever Baba Saladin provides, but Baba Alkalimat, I really want you to talk about, some of the lessons that you learned in the institution building that you've done over the years to help us really frame what we, the 10 plan that you have, the idea of moving towards a future of Africana studies. But I want to bring Baba Saladin Muhammad to speak, bring him up right now. Baba Saladin Muhammad, can you hear? Are you on? I think we're working to get him on.
He's muted.
He's muted.
I think so. Yeah, I didn't hear the question. I had to run away for a minute.
Oh no, we wanted you to add to the conversation. We wanted you, whatever you wanted to add, but if we need to take a detour, we need to run back, whatever you want, to add to this conversation, to really make it a collective process. Go right ahead.
Well, myself, I a little younger than Abdul, not that much, but I go back to the 60s, mid 60s. And this is, for me, this is not anything to brag about or encourage. I was young, dropped out of school, went into the military, came out. And if it wasn't for those study groups, I wouldn't have a level of political consciousness, and even more a confident level of literacy. I knew who do the basic alphabets and some of the basic language, but the question of having confidence even in the language that you're using. The study groups come out of a social movement, a liberation movement. And it was that movement, as a social force that gave many of us confidence in what we were receiving from that movement. It's very difficult when there's not a conscious movement, a conscious political movement, an organized social movement. Not that all will be embraced under the same ideological tendencies, but it's very, very difficult, in my opinion, to have a level of mass confidence as in trying to develop, consciousness and areas of work. I think Abdul's book identifies, it may not have framed it this way, but that many in the movement, the movement was not just the projected leaders, the projected speakers. There was a whole lot of us, you know, who did more printing of leaflets, writing leaflets, making reports on our work, studying, all of those things. And there were a few Black scholars. They may have not been called Black scholars at that time, but or scholar activists who also helped to form those study groups or participate in those study groups. And we had to have confidence because we were learning what people felt that only could be learned in the academy somewhere, you know. So I think his book, you know, we have to at least keep that aspect of our understanding of it in mind, you know. The civil rights movement or the Black freedom movement, called the civil rights movement, the Black power movement, the internationalist movement, all of these created a political climate that reduced some of the reluctancy and fear in some cases of speaking out, of saying what you feel, saying what you study. And that was very important for me because I'll tell the story, the name ain't important. I was at a conference, I think it was probably might have been in 80 something, up in Michigan somewhere. And it was on building the Independent Black Political Party, INBIP. And people put papers down that they had wrote, and I had put something together, a few notes together that could be considered a paper. And this scholar, very well known scholar, wrote a whole bunch of books. He picked it up and he hollered out, he says, there's a Saladin Muhammad here. You know, I heard my name called, you know, by a person that I didn't really know. And the person said to me, he said, man, what school did you go to, comrade? I mean, that's the first question he asked, you know, because he just assumed that somebody, you know, who made an analysis, you know, et cetera, had to come out of the academy, you know. And I think there's been a level of fear, you know, in the Black community, particularly the Black working class, et cetera, of not speaking and those kinds of things. You know, it's a greater level of fear when there's no movement out there, you know. And so I think the book helps to capture that kind of movement. I mean, for me, you know, I owe everything that I, you know, or at least 95% of what I know, I certainly owe something to my parents, you know. But if it wasn't for the movement, you know, wow. I don't know how I would have survived in the military in '65, you know, just before I was getting ready to get out. I don't know how I would have survived, you know, at least, you know, in terms of my mindset. So I think that's about, you know, all. I certainly appreciate what Brother Josh has said. Glad to meet you. We might have seen each other, I'm not sure, before, but I'm very appreciative, you know, of your comments and what at least both you and Abdul has said, how that kind of brings things together. And as a synthesis to produce some new questions that we need to study and answer. That's about all I have.
No, thank you, Baba Alkalimat and Josh, and we actually will Amber Sims will allow her to ask allow them to ask a question as well. But Baba Alkalimat, did you have any comments or responses?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'm reminded of what Frantz Fanon said that we often refer to. Each generation has a mission; it can fulfill it or betray it. So we have that question: what is our mission today? And I'd like to propose two things. First, the movement for social justice, for social transformation. Today, the central question is cadre development. That's what Saladin was just talking about. And by cadre development, what I'm talking about is this. Two things. One is the prevailing ideas of the society have to be combated. That means you have to study and understand what they are. You have to read books. You have to read the columns of and the journals of the ruling class, foreign affairs, and so on. So cadre development is a very serious thing. I mean, they think getting a PhD in the mainstream is important. And it is. But this is equally as important. And just because you have a PhD doesn't mean that you qualify for a cadre in the movement. It may mean the opposite. So anyway, cadre development is really critical right now because we won't have a Black Lives Matter sustainability. We won't have any sustainable movement without cadre. The second thing is about what we can do in Black studies. And I want to revisit what I said earlier about the classroom is where student labor exists. If you have an understanding of the capitalist system, labor is what creates value. Now, for us, the question is, of those hundreds of thousands of student hours that do research, et cetera, you can ask the question, so what? Or if you take the position of the community, what do we get out of that? All those term papers, all those assignments, et cetera, what of value does it have for the community? And it seems to me that we have to capture that labor and we have to focus it so that we can produce things that are of value, incidentally, value for the students, but even more importantly, value for the community. Just imagine if the students in your classroom over a period of time produced writing that was held as value by the community. And the community would then grow proud that they helped and they have this Black Studies program. They don't feel that way now, other than at a symbolic level. There are so many issues: environmental crisis, the whole question of labor, the whole question of educational quality coming out of high schools. I mean, there's a lot of data we need to produce. So the utility of knowledge by the masses of people create a criteria for us in our classroom. We can't act like we can just give meaningless assignments to people because they can learn how to write. They can have useful assignments and learn how to do that same writing. So it seems to me that answer to the Fanon question of what is our mission, I think in the movement, we have to create cadre. Saladin and I have written a pamphlet called 3 Waves. That goes into that question. Then secondly, this question of production, class, situation as a site, not just of consumption, but as a site of production. And our students, I'm talking about first-year students, not even to mention people who are already in their junior and senior year. So anyway, I think that question, what is the mission we have today? We can fulfill it or betray it.
Josh, did you want to add to that, or did we want to? Because there's a few questions I want to kind of tap in together, but please, by all means.
No, I just want to rubber stamp it.
Yeah. No, this is absolutely amazing. Because a lot of these questions, and Baba Alkalimat, one of the things that I want to call attention to those who are going to be engaging this you're mentioning classroom and you're using the term classroom, but this is why we are disrupting that notion of classroom. The Communiversity, and that's what Black Studies does anyway, it's disrupt these notions. But I also want to make sure that we really talk about the access to this knowledge. And I think that's what you're talking about. And it goes back to what I was saying, this needless contestation between study and struggle that I think, moving into the professionalization of research, the professionalization of the academy that Black Studies has to contend with. This is for me, I think that is that struggle that you're talking about. What is the next step? By all means, you can respond to what I just said, but let me pull in a question here, a question or two, if you don't mind. And I also wanted to, I noticed Brother Tom Porter is on this call as well. If he has anything to say, please, by all means, raise your hand, because we would love to, hear your comments, even though we're going to be talking to you next week. But we would love to hear your comments as well, as one who has been engaged right alongside these, these important freedom fighters as we hit here. But let me pull in this question. And I'm going to talk about, the question. And Amber Sims has a question about what inclusive text would you recommend, starting with the must reads, because they are joining from Dallas, Texas on this call right now. So maybe I think that we can think about that and leave that question for the end to like some text. But of course, your book, I would say, honestly, get the book. The book literally outlines and talks about a lot of resources, a lot of text. You can go to Abdul Alkalimat's website as well. If you wanted to answer that question really quick, Abdul Alkalimat, but again, I think it's simple. The book does that. Your website does that, provides a whole study guide. Baba Saladin has done, you've done a lot of work, as you mentioned, with pamphlets and work. But I'll let you go ahead, and if you want to expand upon that before I put in this next question. No, you did good. Okay, yeah. I figured that. Sometimes I don't want to speak for people, but there's the. So this question that I think is important, because I posed this when I sent my comments to you both about the structure, is a question around internationalism, a question around, because you mentioned earlier, you could say more about that Africa has yet to study us. As a person who is engaged on the continent, Tasneem is doing a lot of this work with me. We're constantly going to Kenya. We're constantly in this particular international space, building these things. Say a little bit more about that. Africa is yet to study us. I would argue and say that a lot of the younger folk, particularly in Kenya and other places, are attempting to do that more. But a lot of those young folk face the same issues that young folk here face, about not even knowing their own history, not even understanding, the radical historical figures. So say a little bit more about that. And of course, Josh, if you wanted to add to that in the context of even your upcoming work, how do you disrupt this notion of what we study and how we study, right? And Josh, you could add with that. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think we have to make a distinction between the popular impact of African Americans on Africa and what I'm talking about. Mm. So you can go to a barbershop in an African city and they'll have a sign out asking you, do you want a certain kind of haircut? And they might say a Michael Jackson haircut or a James Brown haircut or whatever. People listen to rap, people listen to music. All of that is promoted by the State Department of the United States. So that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is some serious discussion about Africa and about the impact of colonial and imperialist policies and history and how we can get free. And so that is a big problem on the continent. They have the same problem that we have. People go to Europe or the United States, they get their degrees, they come back, they inadvertently emulate what they learned. And the upsurge, just like we had the 60s, the upsurge in the revolutionary thinking is not as at a high tide in Africa today as it used to be. Back in the days when Abdul Muhammad Babu and Walter Rodney and Wamba Diawamba and other colleagues were really connecting theories of social transformation to the discussion of the African experience. The reason why it's important to raise this question about studying us is that you have to study the enemy, eye on the enemy. And in order to understand the Black experience in the context of imperialism, the furthest probe of Africans into the West is the African-American experience. We are the example of what happens to Black people under the most extreme conditions of being inside the beast, the belly of the beast, so to speak, to use that phrase. So not to study us means you allow an idealism about the possibilities of living in a capitalist society. So Africans who come here, who want to join the middle class, end up adopting ideas that aren't exactly, linking up with the masses of Black people here. Aside from the fact that there's this lingering idea that, well, we're all descendants of slaves and some of them weren't. So there are all kinds of debates that have to go on. My point is that I'm not just talking about another luxury, that, well, we need a course in African Americans. I'm saying that to understand imperialism, understand colonialism in the world, you have to not only understand the particularity of African countries' experience, you have to understand the diaspora. And we are the furthest probe into the West. So it's very important to raise this question. Now, I also want to say this. We spend a lot of money traveling to Africa. We all want to be Bentus. I've been to Africa. That's the new tribe, the Bentus. Now, if you take the money that we have spent over the last decades, there was enough money to build institutions. For example, I know the University of Ghana at Legon would give us land. And for $200,000, we could build a building that could have 2 apartments and classrooms and a computer lab that could be to establish a Center for African American Studies at the University of Ghana. Now, if you think about all the, particularly the well-endowed Black Studies programs, we could do that. It's a lack of imagination and a lack of will on the part of Black people in Black Studies that prevented us from making that kind of linkage. And that kind of linkage is a permanent linkage that could then serve generations of people. And those apartments could be, you could circulate people in and out. They could bring their kids to have a year in Africa or 2 years in Africa. So anyway, it just seems to me that we have to talk about, and see, I think this is the next stage. Let me just say that this fall, I have another book coming out called The Future of Black Studies. So one book is the history of Black Studies. This is the future of Black Studies. And a big part of that is a discussion of the diaspora. And I cover 15 different countries, country by country, in terms of what they're doing, in terms of studying the Black experience in their country, and whether or not they're dealing with the African American experience. So I'm talking about England and France and Germany and China, Russia, et cetera.
Josh, speaking of this notion of study, of course you've just completed your third work looking at this notion of study in the context of what Abdul Alkalimat has just kind of laid out. Mm-hmm. Talk about a little bit of this notion of study, this notion of how do we evolve this idea of study in the context of what, obviously Abdul Alkalimat, but also a lot of the work that you and I are engaged in and really kind of expanding these particular notions.
I mean, a lot of it's already been said, quite frankly. So just a few points, I think, to add to what has just been said. I didn't say this in the biographical part of the conversation, but it took me going to South Africa to understand America as a junior in college. It was Steve Biko for me. It was Robert Sobukwe for me. And so I think there's a potential for this to actually work both ways. And so we know, of course, that Biko would say his influences were Malcolm. And so I mean, it's a really beautiful cycle if you think about it. Black liberation theology being a huge influence also in South Africa, right? But I had to go to South Africa. I mean, and saying where I grew up and saying, you know, my educational experiences, being in South Africa actually opened it up for me. And I also think we need to continue to keep an eye on people like Aikwe Arma and what he's doing, creating educational spaces and writing spaces for Black people in the diaspora. His program still exists. I mean, you can go and learn writing with Aikwe Arma for a year. Theophilo Benga, who is getting up there, but his mission to build a Pan-African university, he's still working on that. And we know that Obenga had connections to African-American studies as well. And there are a few other people on the continent I think we should keep an eye on with respect to that. There are a lot of scholars in South Africa, in fact, that we should keep an eye on in making these sorts of connections. But in terms of my book, this book looks at 4 people: W.E.B. Du Bois, Sylvia Wynter, Jacob Carruthers, and Cedric Robinson. And the idea is to look at the ways in which they studied the African experience by way of their approach to disciplines, how they subverted disciplines, went around disciplines, attacked disciplines, however they did it. It was an attempt to displace the normative models of how to study Black people that were present in the disciplines of their training. And my argument in that book is, by doing that, they offered something to Black studies. They offered something to how we should continue to practice studying ourselves. And so, not to get too much into it, but that's the basic premise of it. And when you look at each of those figures, they created spaces for study, whether it's in the Atlanta University publications and that whole Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, whether it's Sylvia Wynter with Jamaica Journal, whether it's Jacob Carruthers with the Kemetic Institute, or Cedric Robinson with the Black Studies, precursors to Black Studies that they developed in Berkeley in the early 60s. There was always an intentional study that went beyond the curriculum, beyond the accepted, beyond what the disciplines legislated. And that's really where I enter into the conversation with them around the question of Black studies.
Well, thank you. And we are a little bit over time, and I wanted to kind of bring it to a close. Again, I just wanted to call attention to that we will be in conversation with brother Tom Porter next week on next Tuesday, and we'll be expanding a lot on what has been happening here in the conversations and institutionalization, things like that. There is one question left in the question, which is what scholars document the psychological effects of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and racism on the Pan-African community? Again, I would have to point to the book because a lot of these particular resources, and I wanted to make sure that a lot of what we're talking about as far as digitization and documenting, and all those things, we're sitting amongst one of the most foremost in this particular vein of us thinking, because Abdul Alkalimat was writing on this and thinking about this years ago, right? He was digital humanities before digital humanities became a thing. So I want to make sure I do that. But there are a number of scholars and that document the psychological effects. Again, the book highlights some of those. But I wanted to allow our, Josh or Abdul did you want to some that come off, real quick, and also we can follow up that question a little bit later in the on the YouTube, but go right ahead if you wanted to add to that.
Ain't nothing wrong with Fanon. I mean, if that's the baseline, I would start there.
Yeah.
And build from Fanon.
Yeah.
I think there's a series of studies that are really often overlooked that were sponsored by the American Council on Education. And they look at the process of the rural to urban experience that sort of lays a foundation for the Black personality, for what it meant psychologically to be a Black person growing up. So Fraser's book, there's one book called Negro Youth at the Crossroads. There's Growing Up in the Black Belt. I think that's Charles Johnson. There are about 5 volumes that came out of that series.
Allison Davis.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one of the things I would say to younger scholars and students is that pay attention to Black intellectual history. A lot of, and of course, this is a general point that often generations are forgotten. And then people end up trying to reinvent the wheel. And it's often, to an older person, it's kind of curious when people think they've invented something, when in fact, it's something well known by people who are more literate in terms of Black intellectual history. So, you know, it's sort of like being a musician. You can't just pick up a horn and play it. You know, you first have to learn the technical aspects of it. Then you have to learn the history of the horn. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find your own voice. And that's true with the intellectual activity as well.
Well put. We usually call that Christopher Columbusing, you know, the idea that, you know, people discover certain things. I wanted to bring this to a close. I wanted to, again, make sure that, you know, folk who are engaging this now or who will engage this later, this is the inaugural event of Communiversity in partnership with Africa Will Know Project and Black Workers for Justice, again, of which Baba Saladin and Baba Alkalimat and a number of folk who are on this conversation right now are a part of, are attempting to really build these institutions, reinvigorate energy into these institutions as well. So with that being said, I just wanted to, any closing comments for either of you? You know, I will start with Baba Alkalimat and then we will end with Josh.
No, I just want to express my appreciation for being invited to be part of this. And I hope that what comments have been made have been useful to people, and let's keep on keeping on.
Josh?
Thank you to the speakers, and I really enjoyed the conversation, and I really want to encourage people to buy this and all the other new books that are coming out that are telling our stories from our perspective.
Absolutely, and as I said and alluded to, you know, earlier in the conversation, you know, this book really is, you know, history as a weapon. This book is a very important tool within context of not only getting us to think about where we were and where we are, but also really to think about where we're going. And again, Baba Alkalimat got something for us on that coming soon. So with that being said, you know, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with you again. Thank you.